Morning. This lecture video is going to go over the anatomy of the human heart. You can use the diagram that's attached to kind of help you color through these different structures if that's a method that's helpful for you. So first of all, let's look at the location of the heart within the thoracic cavity. The heart is located in the middle of the thoracic cavity, right between the lungs, in a space known as the mediastinum. And so you can kind of see here how the lungs make way for the heart in this particular area. Within the mediastinum, the heart is separated from other mediastinal structures by a tough membrane called the pericardium. Or it's also called the pericardial sac. And it sits in its own space called the pericardial cavity. So this whole area here then is the pericardial cavity. It points towards the left. So the bottom part here, which is called the apex, is going to sit, it doesn't sit exactly center. It actually sits a little bit at the angle with the bottom part of the heart, or the apex of the heart, shifting towards the left. And the lung, well actually the left lung, has a little notch in it called the cardiac notch, which will make room for the bottom parts of the heart. Looking at some pieces of external anatomy. So again, here are the parts of the pericardial cavity and the pericardial sac, which is going to include the pericardium serous membranes. And we talked about this way back at the beginning of the course, but you have the visceral pericardium, which is going to actually line or touch the heart muscle. Then you have this cavity of serous fluid in between that helps lubricate and reduce friction and impact. And then on the outside is a layer called the parietal pericardium. So it sits in these serous membranes. Like I mentioned earlier, the very tip of the heart is called the apex, and the top part of the heart then, the broad part, is called the base. So oftentimes students get confused about that because when we think of base, we think of bottom, but in the heart, the base is the top wide part, and the apex is this kind of pointed part that's going to, notch into that left lung. There's typically, you can see cardiac veins and cardiac arteries on the outside of the heart, and you will see kind of a big groove in the front of the heart and also in the back. In the front of the heart, that groove is called the anterior intraventricular sulcus, and it holds blood vessels. And in the back, it's called the posterior intraventricular sulcus. Your heart inside is made up of four chambers. So 2 upper chambers, which we call atria, and 2 lower chambers, which we call ventricles. Chambers is really just another word for room. So the heart is a 4-roomed structure. And there's a layer of muscle, or myocardium, that's going to divide the 2 atriums on top and divide the 2 ventricles on the bottom. So the interatrial septum divides the 2 atrium, and the intraventricular septum then divides the 2 ventricles. Each side, so the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart, have 1 atrium and 1 ventricle. And each side of the heart then, the left side and the right side, is going to function as 2 distinctive pumps, each with their own job. The left side of the heart is called the systemic circuit, or systemic circulation, because its job is to bring blood from the heart to the rest of the body. The right side of the heart is called the pulmonary circuit, or pulmonary circulation, because its job is to take oxygen-poor blood to the lungs, and pulmonary is the word that we use to describe lungs. So the left side and the right side function in 2 very, very different ways. So we're going to follow the path that blood takes as it enters into the heart, oxygen-poor, goes to the lungs, and then picks up oxygen, comes back into the heart, and then gets delivered to the rest of the body. So the blood is going to enter into the heart through the vena cavas. These are large veins. The superior vena cava is going to come up from the superior end, and the inferior vena cava will come up from the bottom end, both serving like the upper half of the body and the lower half of the body. Blood traveling through these vena cavas are oxygen poor. They've delivered all of their oxygen to the cells and tissues that need it to be. They've picked up all that carbon dioxide, so they have a lot of that waste product in, and they're going to enter the heart in order to get that blood to the lungs to get more oxygen delivered to it. Once the blood enters through these blood vessels, the vena cavas, it will enter into the right atrium, the first of the chambers. Okay. Now, the right atrium, when you look at the heart on the outside, there are these elephant ear-like structures called auricles. These are part of the right atrium. The right atrium is going to fill up with blood. It's going to squeeze or contract, pushing the blood through a flap or a valve here called the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. One way I always remember ventricles is that they form a V at the bottom for ventricles. Once the blood pushes through into that right ventricle and fills up, that flap will close off the right atrium so that blood doesn't backwash in the wrong direction. We want blood to travel through the entire heart in one direction. So that is the function of your valves, is to prevent the backlog of blood or blood going backwards. Tricuspid valve, because there's actually two different cups or folds in them, or three, sorry, tricuspid. Once this blood fills up the right ventricle, this right ventricle then is going to squeeze and it's going to push blood through the next blood vessel called the pulmonary artery, also called the pulmonary trunk. Now, the pulmonary artery also has a valve here called a semilunar valve, which is a pulmonary valve. There are two atrioventricular valves, the ones found between the atrium and the ventricles, and there are two semilunar valves, one between the pulmonary artery and one in the pulmonary vein. So 4 valves, 4 rooms, 4 valves. The blood is going to travel from the pulmonary artery then to the lungs. So this will go to the left lung and this will go to the right lung. Now, just as a side note, make sure that you are aware that this is the right side of the heart here, right? I mean, when we look at it on our diagram, it's on the left side because it's flipped over as we color it. So be very careful about that when you are having to identify something. And I'll give you a way to kind of keep track of right side, left side, just to reassure yourself here in just a second. But so this oxygen poor blood is going to leave the pulmonary artery and it's going to go into the lungs. The pulmonary artery is the only artery in the body that carries oxygen poor blood. It is structurally an artery, which is why we call it an artery. Arteries are thicker than veins, but it does not. Every other artery is going to carry oxygen rich blood. This one does not. It's oxygen poor blood. The blood's going to go to the lungs. It's going to drop off its carbon dioxide. It's going to pick up oxygen to get delivered to the rest of the body, and it's going to re-enter the heart through the next vessels, which are called the pulmonary veins. Again, pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that deliver oxygen-rich blood. They are structurally the same as a vein, which is why they are called a vein. Those pulmonary veins are going to bring the blood into the left side of the heart then, going into the left atrium. The left atrium will fill up with blood, squeeze it through another valve, which is called the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, and then squeeze the blood into the left ventricle. Again, the function of valves, all 4 of them, whether it's the pulmonary, the tricuspid, bicuspid, or the aortic, is to prevent backflow. We want blood moving in the same direction. The ventricle, left ventricle, is going to contract, squeeze through the aortic valve and out the aorta, where the aorta will then branch out into all of the arteries into the body, delivering the oxygen-rich blood to our cells and our tissue. Now, a couple things to note. I talked about making sure you orientate yourself from left side to right side. Think about this for a second. Which side, knowing what you know now, do you think is going to have to generate more force, the right side or the left side? Well, the answer is the left side, right? Because the left side has to generate enough force to get blood throughout the entire body. The right side only has to generate enough force to get blood to the lungs, which are like its next door neighbor, right? It's like throwing a ball to someone right next to you and throwing a ball to someone down the block, right? You're going to have to use more force to get the blood throughout the body. So when looking at a heart, either a heart that's been dissected or a heart model, you can always just tell which is the left and right side by looking at the thickness of the muscle. All of this is muscle here. Okay, this is the myocardium. So this side, you can see, has a lot thicker muscle because it has to generate much greater force. So by looking to see which side is thicker, That's the side that's going to be the left side because that's the side that has to generate more force. Here is the intraventricular septum, so that muscle that divides the two ventricles. Up here, it's hard to see on this diagram, would be the intraatrial septum, the muscle that divides the two atriums. The heart has some different coverings and distinctive units to them, or tissues to them. We already talked about the coverings of the serous membrane, so the parietal pericardium, the pericardial cavity, and the visceral pericardium. But then right underneath the visceral pericardium, it kind of just melds together, is a layer of tissue called the epicardium. This is the outside layer of the actual heart tissue. Inside then is the muscle, so that's the myocardium. So all of this here in red is myocardium. And then there's a layer of tissue that's going to line each of the ventricles and the atriums, which are called the endocardium. In another lecture video, we're going to talk about where these electrical signals actually sit. But this video really I wanted to focus on the actual structures within the heart. If we kind of look here, you can see here's an actual heart on the external surfaces. So right here would be this anterior intraventricular sulcus. So it's kind of a nice starting point to see where you're at. Right here then would be the right ventricle. This would be where your left ventricle is going to sit. Here is the auricles that you can see. There's the left auricle of the left atrium, and here's the auricle of the right atrium. Like I said, I feel like they look like elephant ears. Here's the pulmonary trunk, or the pulmonary artery. So if you stuck a probe through there, it should take you right down to the right ventricle. Here is the aorta up here on top, which will eventually branch into all of the different arteries in your body. So if we looked here at the inside, again, this would be the right ventricle. See the V that forms on the bottom? This would be the left ventricle. And look, I mean, you can definitely see how much smaller or thinner this layer of muscle is than over here on the left side. So then here's the auricle again. So that would be the left atrium. This would be the right atrium up in here. This would be the pulmonary trunk, so leading into or from that right ventricle. You can see over here this valve. So in this case, it's on the left side, so it's the bicuspid or the mitral valve. All of the valves are kind of held into the heart muscle by these little cords called the chordinae tendae, and they will keep the flap moving up and down or allow it to open and then allow it to shut, which will all be generated by pressure. And then back up here would be where your aorta is. So if you actually were able to cut the heart open, that's what you would be able to see. This is the intraventricular septum, and then up here would be the intraatrial septum.